Edward IV was the King of England from the 4th of March 1461 until the 3rd of October 1470, and again from the 11th of April 1471 until his death in 1483. He was the first Yorkist King of England. The first half of his rule was marred by the violence associated with the Wars of the Roses, but he overcame the Lancastrian challenge to the throne at Tewkesbury in 1471 to reign in peace until his sudden death. Before becoming king, he was 4th Duke of York, 7th Earl of March, 5th Earl of Cambridge and 9th Earl of Ulster. He was also the 65th Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Reign. Accession to the throne. Edward of York was born at Rouen in France, the second son of Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. He was the eldest of the 4 sons who survived to adulthood. Before his father's death and his accession to the throne, he bore the title Earl of March. Edward's father Richard, Duke of York, had been heir to King Henry VI until the birth of Henry's son Edward in 1453. Locked in a factional struggle with the king's Beaufort relatives, Richard established a dominant position after his victory at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, in which his chief rival, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, was killed. However, over the following years Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, rebuilt a powerful faction to oppose him. In 1459 Margaret moved against York and his principal supporters, his brother-in-law Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who rose in revolt. After the collapse of their army in the confrontation at Ludford Bridge, the Yorkist leaders fled from England. York took refuge in Ireland, while Edward went with the Nevilles to Calais, where Warwick was governor. In 1460, Edward landed in Kent with Salisbury. Warwick and Salisbury's brother William Neville, Lord Fauconberg, raised an army and occupied London, leaving Salisbury besieging the Tower of London. Edward, Warwick and Fauconberg advanced against the king, who was with an army in the Midlands, and defeated and captured him in the Battle of Northampton. Having returned to England, York was declared the king's heir, but Queen Margaret raised a fresh army against him, and he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield on 30 December 1460, along with his younger son Edmund, Earl of Rutland and the Earl of Salisbury. This left Edward at the head of the Yorkist faction. Having defeated a Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire on 2–3 February 1461, he united his forces with those of Warwick, who had been defeated by Margaret's army at the Second Battle of St. Albans, during which Henry VI had been rescued by his supporters, whereas his father had restricted his ambitions to becoming Henry's heir. Edward now took the more radical step of proclaiming himself king in March 1461. He then advanced against the Lancastrians and defeated them in the exceptionally bloody Battle of Towton in Yorkshire on 29 March. Having effectively broken the military strength of the Lancastrians, Edward returned to London for his coronation. Lancastrian resistance continued in the north, but posed no serious threat to the new regime and was finally extinguished by Warwick's brother John Neville in the Battle of Hexham in 1464. Henry VI had escaped into the Pennines, where he spent a year in hiding but was finally caught and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Queen Margaret fled abroad with the young Prince Edward and many of their leading supporters. While Edward IV had deposed Henry VI, as long as the latter's son remained alive there was little point in killing him, since this would merely have transferred the Lancastrian claim from a captive king to one who was at liberty. Even at the age of 19, Edward exhibited remarkable military acumen. He also had a notable physique and was described as handsome and affable. His height is estimated at 6 feet 4.5 inches, making him the tallest among all English, Scottish and British monarchs to date. Overthrow. Since most of England's leading families had remained loyal to Henry VI or remained uncommitted in the recent conflict, the new regime relied heavily on the support of the Nevilles, who held vast estates and had been so instrumental in bringing Edward to the throne. However, the king increasingly became estranged from their leader, the Earl of Warwick, due primarily to his marriage. Warwick, acting on Edward's behalf, made preliminary arrangements with King Louis XI of France for Edward to marry either Louis's daughter Anne, or his sister-in-law Bona of Savoy. He was humiliated and enraged to discover that while he was negotiating, Edward had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of John Grey of Groby, on the 1st of May 1464. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville has been criticised as an impulsive action which did not add anything to the security of England or the York dynasty. A horrified Privy Council, when he announced the marriage to them, told him, with unusual frankness, that he must know that she was no wife for a prince such as himself, for she was not the daughter of a duke or earl, but a simple knight. Christine Carpenter argues against the idea that it had any political motivation, and that Edward's creation of a strong Yorkist nobility meant he did not need the relatively lightweight connections of the Woodvilles. Whereas Wilkinson, writing in 1964, described the marriage as both a love match, and also a cold and calculated political move. J.R. Landis suggested in 1980 that the king was merely infatuated, echoing P.M. Kendall's view that he was acting out of lust. Elizabeth's mother was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, widow of Henry VI's uncle, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, but her father, Richard Woodville, 1st Earl Rivers, was a newly created baron. Catherine Woodville married Henry Stafford, grandson and heir to the Duke of Buckingham, and Anne Woodville became the wife of William, Viscount Boucher, eldest son and heir of the Earl of Essex, and Eleanor Woodville married Anthony Grey, son and heir of the Earl of Kent. The abrupt rise of the Woodville family created animosity among the nobility of England, above all in the case of Warwick. The offence caused by the circumstances of the marriage itself was magnified as the Woodvilles opposed policies favoured by Warwick and successfully exploited their influence with the king to defeat him. Over time, as Warwick became progressively more alienated from King Edward, his intentions turned toward treason. In the autumn of 1467, Warwick withdrew from the court to his Yorkshire estates. With the aid of Edward's disaffected younger brother George, Duke of Clarence, Warwick covertly instigated a rebellion against the king. The main part of the king's army was defeated at the Battle of Edgecote Moor on 26 July 1469, and Edward was subsequently captured at Olney. Warwick then attempted to rule in Edward's name, but the nobility, many of whom owed their preferments to the king, were restive, and with the emergence of a local rebellion in the north, it became increasingly clear that Warwick was unable to rule through the king. He was forced to release Edward on 10 September 1469. At this point Edward did not seek to destroy either Warwick or Clarence but instead sought reconciliation. Nevertheless, when a private feud in Lincolnshire broke out between Sir Thomas Burr of Gainesville in Lincolnshire and Lord Wells, also of Lincolnshire, a few months later in March 1470, Warwick and Clarence chose this opportunity to rebel against Edward IV again. The Lincolnshire rebellion against King Edward IV was defeated and Warwick was forced to flee to France on 1 May 1470. There, he made an alliance with the former Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou. Louis XI, who had just come to the throne of France with the death of his father, King Charles VII on 25 July 1461, had been looking for a way to trouble Edward IV by reinvigorating the Lancastrian claim to the throne of England. In an accord between Louis XI, Queen Margaret and himself, Warwick agreed to restore Henry VI in return for French support for a military invasion of England. Warwick's invasion fleet set sail from France for England on 9 September 1470. This time, Edward IV was forced to flee to Flanders when he learned that Warwick's brother, John Neville, 1st Marquis of Montague, had also switched to the Lancastrian side, making Edward's military position untenable. Restoration. Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne in 1470 in an event known as the Readoption of Henry VI, and Edward took refuge in Flanders, part of Burgundy, accompanied by his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Since the marriage of Edward IV's sister, Margaret of York, to Charles, Duke of Burgundy on 3 July 1468, the Duke of Burgundy had been Edward's brother-in-law. Despite the fact that Charles was initially unwilling to help Edward, the French declared war on Burgundy. This prompted Charles to give his aid to Edward, and from Burgundy he raised an army to win back his kingdom. When Edward returned to England with a relatively small force, he avoided capture. The city of York only opened its gates to him after he promised that he had just come to reclaim in his dukedom, as Henry Bolingbroke had done 70 years earlier. The first to join him were Sir James Harrington and William Parr, who brought 600 men-at-arms to Edward at Doncaster, and as he marched southwards he began to gather support, including Clarence. Edward entered London unopposed, where he took Henry VI prisoner. Edward and his brothers then defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and with Warwick dead he eliminated the remaining Lancastrian resistance at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. The Lancastrian heir, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, was killed on the battlefield. A few days later, on the night that Edward re-entered London, Henry VI died. One contemporary chronicle claimed that his death was due to melancholy, but it is widely suspected that Edward ordered Henry's murder to remove the Lancastrian opposition completely. Edward's two younger brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, were married to Isabel Neville and Anne Neville. They were both daughters of Warwick by Anne Beauchamp and rival heirs to the considerable inheritance of their still-living mother, leading to a dispute between the brothers. According to a long-standing tradition, he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Later reign and death. Edward did not face any further rebellions after his restoration, as the Lancastrian line had virtually been extinguished, and the only rival left was Henry Tudor, who was living in exile. In 1475, Edward declared war on France, landing at Calais in June. However, the failure of his ally Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, to provide any significant military assistance led him to undertake negotiations with the French. He came to terms with the Treaty of Picquigny, which provided him with an immediate payment of 75,000 crowns and a yearly pension of 50,000 crowns, thus allowing him to recoup his finances. He also backed an attempt by Alexander Stewart, 1st Duke of Albany, brother of King James III of Scotland, to take the Scottish throne in 1482. Gloucester led an invasion of Scotland that resulted in the capture of Edinburgh and the King of Scots himself, but Albany reneged on his agreement with Edward. Gloucester decided to withdraw from his position of strength in Edinburgh. However, Gloucester did recover Berwick-upon-Tweed. Edward's health began to fail, and he became subject to an increasing number of ailments. He fell fatally ill at Easter 1483, but lingered on long enough to add some codicils to his will, the most important being his naming of his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector after his death. He died on the 9th of April 1483 and was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. He was succeeded by his 12-year-old son, Edward V of England, and then by his brother, Richard. It is not known what actually caused Edward's death. Pneumonia and typhoid have both been conjectured, as well as poison. Some attributed his death to an unhealthy lifestyle, as he had become stout and inactive in the years before his death. Overview. Achievements. An extremely capable and daring military commander, Edward crushed the House of Lancaster in a series of spectacular military victories. He was never defeated on the field of battle, despite his occasional political setbacks, usually at the hands of his great Machiavellian rival, Louis XI of France. Edward was a popular and very able king. While he lacked foresight and was at times cursed by bad judgment, he possessed an uncanny understanding of his most useful subjects, and the vast majority of those who served him remained unwaveringly loyal until his death. Domestically, Edward's reign saw the restoration of law and order in England. The latter days of Henry VI's government had been marked by a general breakdown in law and order, as well as a sizable increase in both piracy and banditry. He also made the Duchy of Lancaster property of the Crown, which it still is today. During the reign of Henry there had been corruption in the Exchequer. Edward made his household gain more control over finances and even investigated old records to see payments had been made. Documents of the Exchequer show him sending letters threatening officials if they did not pay money. His properties earned large amounts of money for the Crown. The court of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville was described by a visitor from Europe as the most splendid in all Christendom. Edward spent large amounts on expensive status symbols to show off his power and wealth as legitimate monarch of England. His collecting habits show that he was not only a good soldier and administrator, but had an eye for fashionable style and an interest in scholarship, particularly history. In addition to fine clothes, jewels and furnishings, he acquired a collection of beautifully illuminated historical and literary manuscripts, many of which were made specially for him by craftsmen in Bruges. The contents of these works tell us something of his interests. They focus on the lives of great rulers including Julius Caesar, historical chronicles, as well as instructional and religious works. These were books for both entertainment and instruction. It is not known where or how Edward's library was stored, but it is recorded that he transferred volumes from the Great Wardrobe to Eltham Palace and that he had a yeoman to keep the king's books. The fact that more than 40 of his books survive intact from the 15th century suggests that they were carefully stored together. Today they form the foundation of the royal collection of manuscripts at the British Library. Dynasty. Ultimately, despite his military and administrative genius, Edward's dynasty survived him by little more than 2 years. But Edward was one of the few male members of his dynasty to die of natural causes. Both Edward's father and brother were killed at the Battle of Wakefield, while his grandfather and another brother were executed for treason. Edward's 2 sons were imprisoned and disappeared in a year of Edward's death. The king's youngest brother, Richard, was famously killed in battle against Henry Tudor at Bosworth Field. This was the end of the reign of the House of York and of the Plantagenet family's rule. However, soon after Henry Tudor took the throne as Henry VII, he married Edward's eldest daughter Elizabeth of York, who was at that point the family heiress. Through her, the Plantagenet family and the House of York continue in the line of English and British sovereigns. Ancestry.